Supreme Court of Louisiana. Oyez, oyez, oyez. The Honorable Supreme Court of the State of Louisiana is now in session. Order and silence are commanded under penalty of law. God save the state and this honorable court.
We're here today at the Cabildo in New Orleans, and it's a very special event. We're actually going to hold a Supreme Court session here in the Sala Capitular, which was one of the early locations for the Louisiana Supreme Court. And this event is a run-up event, one of several that we'll be having in commemoration of our court's 200th anniversary as a constitutional body, which will take place on March 1st, 2013.
Today's sitting in the Cabildo marks the beginning of our commemoration of the bicentennial of the first sitting of the Louisiana Supreme Court in 1813. Our bicentennial celebration is being coordinated by Justice Greg Guidry, and several events are scheduled during the coming year, culminating in a ceremony at the court in the French Quarter on March 1, 2013, exactly 200 years after the Louisiana Supreme Court first convened on March 1, 1813. Today is the first time the court has returned to the Cabildo since 1910. The justices and I are proud to be a part of this historic occasion. Beginning in the early 1700s, the Cabildo site was the location of official government and judicial offices. As New Orleans was laid out as a French colonial settlement in 1718, Jackson Square, the Place d'Armes, housed the three institutions common to new settlements: the town hall, the Catholic church, and the military arsenal. During the period of French settlement from 1718 to 1763, the site also hosted the city police station, the Corps de Garde, the courtroom, civil and military prisons, and quarters for jailers and officers of the guard. During the period of Spanish rule, from 1763 to 1803, Spanish Governor Alejandro O'Reilly ordered in 1795 the construction of a new Cabildo, or town hall. The building was a wooden single-story Creole-style structure, a single pitch roof from front to back, and a gallery. The Great Fire of 1788 destroyed the first Cabildo structure, along with most of the wooden French colonial structures in the Upper French Quarter. Spanish philanthropist Don Alamaster de Roja then donated the funds for the construction of the present Spanish-style Cabildo, which was completed around 1798. A great deal of history has taken place in this building. The Cabildo was the site of two political transfers related to the Louisiana Purchase. It was in this room, the Sala Capitular, that the first transfer of Louisiana from Spain to France occurred on November 30th, 1803. It was also in this room, just 20 days later, on December 20th, 1803, that the transfer ceremony from France to the United States took place, with the United States purchase of Louisiana from France for $15 million. During the American period, 1803 to 1910, the Cabildo served as the site of city council chambers, the mayors, and city offices. And in April 1825, the Cabildo was briefly converted to the quarters of the Marquis de Lafayette when he was heralded on a national tour of the country. From 1853 to 1910, when it was converted to a museum, the Cabildo, and specifically this room, the Sala Capitular, served as the home of the Louisiana State Supreme Court. Previously, the court was housed in the Government House and the Presbytere. Several important cases were heard in this room, such as, from 1834 to 1890, the Myra Clark Gaines cases, which focused on women's property rights and inheritance issues, was the longest-running court battle in United States history. It involved a series of several lawsuits in which the United States Supreme Court heard 17 cases, and the Louisiana State Supreme Court heard arguments 5 times. Fuente versus Gaines was heard in the Cabildo in 1873. The slaughterhouse cases involved 6 lawsuits brought by private butchers against the slaughterhouse monopoly legislation enacted in 1869. The cases involve the 14th Amendment issue of a citizen's right, is the right of the private butchers to operate their trade. The state Supreme Court construed the 14th Amendment very narrowly and upheld the monopoly legislation. These cases were appealed to the United States Supreme Court, which decided in April 1873 to also uphold the Louisiana legislation, ruling that it did not violate the 14th Amendment. And perhaps the most famous case, Plessy v. Ferguson, the Louisiana State Supreme Court heard Plessy v. Ferguson in this room. The civil rights case involved Homer Plessy fighting against Jim Crow legislation in reaction to the Louisiana Separate Car Law of 1890, which legalized racially segregated railroad cars. Homer Plessy sued the East Louisiana Railroad, and Judge Ferguson ruled in favor of the railroad, so Plessy filed suit against Ferguson. In 1892, the Louisiana State Supreme Court ruled in favor of Ferguson, and Plessy appealed to the United States Supreme Court. In 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the Louisiana state decision and thus sanctioned the legalization of Jim Crow legislation, which remained in effect until overturned in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. It is interesting to note that Homer Plessy is buried in St. Louis No. 1 Cemetery, and the family donated his original stone to the Cabildo Museum when it was replaced in 2009. Please stop by and see it on your way out today. So, to the attorneys who are arguing here today, you are adding to the history of this room. In 1910, the Louisiana State Supreme Court moved from the Cabildo to the newly constructed Civil Courts building located in the 400 block of Royal and Chartist Streets. In 1958, the court moved to a new modern Supreme Court building at 301 Loyola Avenue, but in May 2004, following more than 20 years of planning and a grand restoration, the court returned to its French Quarter home just down the street from us, where it resides today.
Prior to statehood, there was a territorial court, which was the superior court of the territory of Orleans, which also met in this room at periods during its history in other locations in the city, beginning in 1804.
And the significance of the Cabildo?
Well, you know, the Cabildo was the seat of government in the early days of Louisiana history, and that was a natural location for its Supreme Court to have some of its early sessions, and also the territorial court before that.
What type of events are going to be scheduled for the bicentennial of the Louisiana Supreme Court?
Well, this is our first event to come back to the place where the court originally met. And another thing many people don't realize is in its early years, the Louisiana Supreme Court was a traveling court. Half the court sessions of the year were in New Orleans and half were in other parts of the state. Sometimes Alexandria, sometimes Natchitoches, sometimes Opelousas, and other locations. And we'll be going to Natchitoches later in the year to actually hold a court session there, again, to commemorate those early days of the justices traveling. And as you can imagine, in the early 1800s, it was not an easy thing to do. Much of the trip would be by boat, by carriage, and just to get from New Orleans to a place like Natchitoches would take much more than the few hours it would take us by car.
And now, for the first time in over 100 years, as we begin the commemoration of the bicentennial of our court, the justices of the Louisiana Supreme Court will once again hear oral arguments in this historic room. Following today's arguments, we invite the attorneys and our honored guests to join us at a reception in the foyer. Turning now to today's docket, the first case on our docket is State of Louisiana versus Joshua Don Williams.
Madam Chief Justice, Associate Justices, good afternoon. My name is Jacqueline Chapman on behalf of the State of Louisiana. I'd please like to reserve 2 minutes for rebuttal. Your Honors, the matter before the court today presents an issue of statutory constitutionality. Namely, the defendant appellee seeks an affirmance from this court that Louisiana Code of Criminal Procedure Article 404B, which pertains to the procedure for the appointment of jury commissioners in East Baton Rouge Parish, is unconstitutional because it is a local or special law prohibited by Louisiana Constitution, Article 3, Section 12.
Was that in fact the trial judge's decision? Because he seemed to go to great pains to make it clear that he was not declaring the statute unconstitutional.
We absolutely agree with that, Justice Guidry. We actually filed our direct appeal to the First Circuit Court of Appeal, arguing that Judge Johnson specifically, in the record, it shows that he was not ruling on the constitutionality of that statute. He, for other reasons.
Tell us what goes through your mind as you come through this historic building and listen to an actual case.
Well, what really comes flooding to you here is the history of our court. You know, Louisiana law is even much older than statehood. It's even much older than the time of the Louisiana Purchase. Louisiana law began with the French and Spanish colonists, and of course they brought with them ancient Roman law. So the law that we have in Louisiana today, it's hard to imagine, but really goes back thousands of years to ancient Rome, and it was transferred from the Romans to the Spanish to the French and then to us. So it's a very ancient law that we have in Louisiana. And at the time of statehood, there was much debate whether Louisiana would retain that law, that special law, which we call the civil law or the Roman law, or whether it would adopt the law that was applicable in the rest of the country, which was basically the English common law. And there was quite a bit of discord, quite a bit of discussion, and ultimately the civil law prevailed, and Louisiana has remained to this day a civil law jurisdiction. So the history is tremendous and very old.
People talk about the Napoleonic Code. Explain what that is.
Well, the Napoleonic Code, I'm glad you mentioned that, because people assume that Louisiana has adopted the Napoleonic Code. But in reality, Louisiana has never adopted the Napoleonic Code. The Napoleonic Code was created by the Emperor Napoleon, and it was a codification of the French laws that existed at the time, which was also based upon the Roman law. At the time that was occurring, Louisiana was having this debate that I mentioned, whether or not to keep the civil law or to move to become a common law system. Once the decision was made to retain the civil law, a group of jurisconsults were put together by the Louisiana legislature, or the Legislative Assembly at that time, and asked to create a code for Louisiana. What they did was they borrowed provisions from the Napoleonic Code that fit in Louisiana. They also created other provisions that were unique to the Spanish law heritage of Louisiana. And the result of that was what we call the Digest of 1808. And the Digest of 1808 borrows heavily from the Napoleonic Code or the French Code Civil, but it was never adopted in whole part. And the ancient Roman law and the ancient Spanish laws came to us through our code, the Digest of 1808.
Today, to mark the anniversary, you're hearing a case, a typical case that the Supreme Court normally would hear. For people that don't get a chance to visit the Supreme Court, tell us what is the typical procedure when a case comes before the court?
Well, the Louisiana Supreme Court is a very busy court with a heavy docket. We receive about 3,000 writ applications each year, and these writ applications are requests from litigants who believe that the decisions at the lower courts, the trial court and the lower courts of appeal, was not correct. Whenever one side wins and one side loses, very often one side feels like they should have won. And those are writ applications which we review every week here in New Orleans in our conferences. Of those approximately 3,000 writ applications, only about 7% are actually granted. And the ones that are granted are the ones that are scheduled for oral argument in our courtroom. And today we'll be hearing two cases in which the writs were granted. And those are the cases where the attorneys come to the courtroom and argue their positions, brief their positions, and then ultimately we will follow that with a full formal written opinion. And those opinions become the law of the land in Louisiana.
On this historic day, what would you like people to keep in mind about the work of the Louisiana Supreme Court?
Well, several things. You know, it's a very busy court, and I think people don't really quite understand how hard the Louisiana Supreme Court works and how hard the people in our building work, our staff works. Our law clerks, our clerk of court, our judicial administrator, all the folks that really support us and keep the court moving forward. It's a huge caseload. The other thing to think about, I believe, is the importance of the justice system in our society. We take it for granted, and it is not perfect. And very often we focus on the imperfections. But I think today is a good day to focus on really what works properly. You know, the majority of disputes that our citizens have are resolved peacefully in our court system. Criminal cases are prosecuted, in most cases, successfully. leading to conviction when that's probably an appropriate result, keeping our citizens safe. Day to day, our court system operates wonderfully. We have hardworking judges throughout the state who do the best they can, who work very hard, and I think that's something to be proud of. And the third thing, I believe, is it's a good time to reflect on our history. It would have been very easy for them to just jettison the hundreds of years of legal history that we had in Louisiana and just become like any other state, and that was not done. As a matter of fact, at the time when that was being considered, the citizens of Louisiana published a manifesto on the New Orleans Times-Picayune in which they passionately asked the Governor Claiborne at the time, who despite his French name was a common law lawyer, and wanted to adopt a common law in Louisiana, as did President Thomas Jefferson, but they resisted that. And it was a passionate plea that anyone can look up. It's in the front edition of our current civil code, and it shows how much the law meant to the people at that time, and I believe it still has very much relevance and a lot of life left in it today.
What's your reaction to being able to participate in this historic bicentennial observance of the Louisiana Supreme Court?
I'm just glad that I'm able to be here at this time and be part of this. In preparation for this, I've read a lot about the early justices and the early judges of the Superior Court, and there were great jurisconsults, great judges, and it's quite humbling to realize that you're part of that chain. It also makes you realize that it is a long chain, that the things that they did, the problems that they grappled with, are really the same problems that we grapple with today. And the way that they operated is very much in line with the way that we operate today. So it really gives you a great deal of perspective, and it makes you realize that you're part of something much larger than our day-to-day concerns.
If people have questions or like more information, what should they do?
I would invite people to come to visit our building. We're at 400 Royal Street in the middle of the French Quarter in New Orleans. And the Supreme Court is more than just a courthouse. There's a library there. The state law library is in our building, and it's a fantastic library. There are old books there. Our oldest book is a copy of the Spanish text, Las Siete Partidas, and our copy was created in the 1500s. The original Las Siete Partidas was created in the 1300s, and our copy dates to the 1500s. We have a wonderful library. We have a museum which covers the lives and the history of the court, including the justices and the chief justices. And it's a great place for people to visit. It's open to the public, and they will really, I think, enjoy it and get a great deal of knowledge about our court system.